response to some of the issues that are identified in the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, Baddeley and Hitch put forward a alternative concept of short-term memory and introduced the notion of this working memory system. And this is still probably the most widely used and accepted model of memory. And there are really kind of two standout differences with this model. The first one is that you've got a memory store, or this kind of short-term memory store, that again is still limited in capacity, but it's there both for the short-term sort of maintenance of knowledge and information, but also this ability to manipulate, so to perform mental operations on the contents of this memory store. And then the second fundamental difference was that it really started to incorporate the fact that we have distinct short-term memory systems for auditory and visual information. So let's have a look at an introduction to the working memory model.
Talking of short-term memory as a single, unified concept is like calling a multi-tool a mere flip knife. It's like saying pizza is made from pizza. It's time to find out what the short-term memory equivalents of flour, eggs, tomato and cheese are. And so we open our recipe book to Baddeley and Hitch's working memory model. This cognitive model proposed a new structure for short-term memory, though doesn't really say much about short-term memory's relationship with long-term memory. Anyway, here are the ingredients. The central executive, one phonological loop, one visual spatial sketchpad, and an episodic buffer. Let's start with the important sounding central executive. A great name, but not so much is known about this central element of the model. The central executive has been included in the model in an effort to account for the organization of information attended by the slave systems. You could say that the central executive is something of a line manager. It determines information, but doesn't do a huge amount itself. On to the slave systems and the hugely hard-working phonological loop, a temporary storage system for auditory information. The store can be subdivided into two parts: the phonological store, the inner ear, which stores what you hear, and the articulatory process, the inner voice, which rehearses words to keep them in working memory whilst needed. The second slave system is the visuospatial sketchpad, responsible for dealing with spatial and visual information, compliments to the imaginative naming committee. The visuospatial sketchpad also has two constituent parts: the visual cache, which stores visual data such as shape and colour, and the inner scribe, which records the arrangements of objects and transfers information to the central executive, probably in the hope of an end-of-year bonus. The final slave system in Baddeley and Hitch's model is the episodic buffer. As with the central executive, less is known about this element of the model than the phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad, but theorists included it in the model in a bid to account for the interaction between working memory and long-term memory. So, does working memory work as a model for memory? Well, aside from the limited information about the central executive and episodic buffer, yes it does. Baddeley and Hitch's own research using a dual task paradigm demonstrates that people are able to complete two tasks simultaneously if they are using different processing systems. But it becomes difficult to complete two tasks at the same time if they use the same slave system. Try these examples yourself and you'll probably get similar results. First, try to pat your stomach and rub your head at the same time. Both of these tasks employ the visual spatial sketchpad. It's hard. If you managed it, it took effort. Now pat your head and say the alphabet. Easy. You're still completing two tasks, but because one task relies on the phonological loop, whilst the other calls upon the visual spatial sketchpad, you're able to multitask with few or no errors. Evidence from the KF case study adds further support for the suggestion that the slave systems are not only operationally distinct, but anatomically separate too. KF experienced brain damage as a result of a motorbike accident, But whilst his verbal memory was impaired, his ability to recall and learn visual information was largely unaffected. Baddeley and Hitch opened the door to understandings of short-term memory being a complex interaction between several processes rather than a unified store. But this model is unlikely to provide the complete picture. Share your thoughts in the comments below and make sure you're subscribed to Psychology Unlocked for all the latest videos. For more videos, articles and revision aids, head over to Psychology.
Okay, so I think that's a nice sort of overview and summary of the working memory model. Just to recap this, we've basically got this phonological loop that's essentially, you can think of it as your kind of inner voice that's going to be used to store phonological information, so typically verbal information. You can engage in subvocal rehearsal. So again, if you think about that you've been given someone's telephone number and you're trying to keep this in short-term memory, repeating this over to yourself would involve part of the phonological loop. And this is essentially how short-term memory was described by Atkinson and Schifrin. We then have the visuospatial sketchpad. So again, you think of this like an inner eye that's involved in visual and spatial coding. So everything to do with sort of mental rotation or remembering the layout of a room. And both of these two systems interact and receive verbal and visual information respectively. We then have this episodic buffer in the middle, and this is basically serving to try and integrate the information that comes from these different systems and long-term memory to try and create some sort of unified percept, so some way of combining this verbal and visual information. And then finally we have a central executive, and you can think of this as almost like a supervisory system. It's modality free and essentially is engaged in controlling attention and complex processing tasks. Now, as we mentioned, one of the big differences between the Atkinson-Schifrin model and the Baddeley-Hitch is that all of the components in the working memory model, they have a limited capacity still, but they operate essentially independently. So for example, the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad, in theory they should be able to operate at the same time in parallel without interfering with each other. So if you're performing one task that requires spatial processing, you should be able to do this without having too much impact on storing verbal information in the phonological loop. Now, the multi-store model of Atkinson-Schifrin's also proposed that the short-term memory both stores and processes information across both modalities. So in other words, we're storing phonological and visuospatial information in one single short-term memory store. So this leads to a sort of testable prediction that you can make, that if you ask someone to perform two concurrent tasks that involve verbal and spatial processing, then according to Atkinson-Schifrin, performance should be impaired if we assume that they involve the same short-term memory resources and actually interfere with each other. However, Baddeley and many others found out that people were actually pretty good at doing these two tasks at the same time. So indeed, a central approach that they've taken in a lot of their research was to test what happens when you ask people to do two tasks at the same time, one verbal, one testing spatial abilities, typically known as a dual task paradigm. So one example of such a dual task paradigm is some research reported by Robbins et al. And if we examine this evidence in practice, they looked at the performance of chess players that were trying to perform complex chess moves whilst also being distracted or being asked to perform a secondary task. Now, chess is a game that involves a lot of spatial processing to decide on the best move. So you're working out the spatial properties of where your piece is located and where you can move next, where they're going to move next, and several moves in advance. So what happens to chess players' performance when you give them a dual task to perform? So if we look at the graph here, on the y-axis we're plotting the quality of their chess move, so the higher score the better. We've got different coloured bars representing the performance of weak and strong chess players. For the sake of our argument here, you can just focus on the performance of the stronger chess players. So on the left we have a control condition, so there's no distraction task, and their performance is pretty good for the strong chess players. When you then give them a articulatory suppression task, so if you remember what this is, it's like a phonological distractor that you would have to repeat a particular word or count backwards, etc. Something that would limit subvocal rehearsal. Their performance doesn't really degrade at all. So it's a little bit lower, but it's pretty much the same. If you then give them a task that impairs the visuospatial sketchpad, so if you ask them to do something spatially oriented, or if you give something that consumes the central executive, so if there's something that requires their attention and cognitive control, in those conditions, the performance is still better than the weaker chess players, but it drops off substantially. So it's pretty convincing evidence of a distinction between how visuospatial distractors and phonological distractors are influencing performance. So the phonological loop is basically a kind of short-term memory store for verbal, speech-based information that can then be broken down also in two separate subcomponents. So we've got this phonological store, which allows us to store or hold verbal information in a sort of passive way, and this decays very quickly. So again, in roughly sort of 2, 3, 4 seconds, it's going to decay from there unless it's refreshed. How do we refresh it? Well, through rehearsal. So through some form of subvocal rehearsal. So it's not you saying it out loud, but just mentally repeating that word in our head is going to be important for keeping it within this phonological store, within the phonological loop. Now, an important question that we haven't really covered is that how do you actually know that people use the phonological loop to encode written words? So if I'm giving you a series of words that you're reading, so you've got a sentence here, you could argue that I don't encode those in an acoustic format. What I encode them in is in terms of their visual representation. So how could we distinguish between whether you're encoding it in visual as opposed to using the verbal properties? And one way to examine this is to see what happens if we ask people to remember words that sound similar but look different to each other. So if we find that people are using a phonological loop, or certainly the verbal representation of words, to store this information of the words, then you would expect there to be learning differences based on the phonology or the sounds of words that people are learning. And this is the case. So we find that if we give people words that share a lot of similarities, such as fi, he, ni, li, me, and you ask them to recall them, versus giving them a series of words that don't share phonological similarity, but are similar in kind of length and complexity, such as bay, ho, it, odd, shy, up. People are much better at remembering the second list of words. So there seems to be more confusion when you have this sort of phonological similarity. So another source of evidence that we encode things phonologically comes from evidence we've already seen with the word length effect. So if there's the idea that this phonological loop has a limited capacity, it would be easier to remember a list of short words than a list of long words, because more short words can fit into this loop. And again, because it takes longer to say longer words, when we're rehearsing them, more forgetting is going to occur the more time has passed. So there's very robust effects for that. We've also got the visuospatial sketchpad. So this is used for the temporary storage and manipulation of visual patterns and spatial movement. It's got a really limited capacity, so there's only about 3 to 4 items that we can store there at any one time. One of the ways that you might test this is doing something known as a change detection task. So you might see an array with between 3 to 12 objects that are presented on the screen, and your job is to notice which of these objects changes or disappears. And we can do this perfectly when there are 4 objects presented. But anything beyond this, and our performance really seems to decline. So if there's 6 or 7 objects that are there and one of them changes, often we're not going to notice. And so this suggests that round about 4 objects is the upper limit of what we can reliably hold information about within this visuospatial sketchpad. But it's also broken down into 2 smaller subcomponents. So we've got a visual cache, and it's basically holds spatial information, and then we've got an inner scribe that carries out cognitive operations on it. So you could imagine holding spatial information would be hold the coordinates of something, and then if we wanted to engage in some sort of mental rotation, the inner scribe would be what manipulates that information that is being held in the visual cache. So we're making this argument basically that we've got these 2 separate mechanisms or separate systems that are going to be involved in processing things in the visual format. So what is it versus processing things in a spatial format, so processing elements of motion detail. So how might you actually go about testing if you've got separate visual and spatial systems? And one elegant study by Clower and Zhao, they studied this over a range of different sort of 6 experiments. What I'm going to describe for you now is just one experiment that I think illustrates this dissociation quite well. So in this first experiment, they asked participants to perform one of 2 tasks. So there was a spatial task where you had to memorize the location of a dot. So a dot could appear in one of 12 different locations, and your job is just to remember where was the spatial location that this appeared at. And then there was a visual task. So you could be presented one of 6 different Chinese ideographs. So they're quite difficult to remember if you haven't seen and you're not familiar with what a Chinese ideograph is. So you're presented one of these, and you've got to memorize this and distinguish whether that's what you see later on. Now, in the retention period, so essentially at the kind of same time as they were asked to do this, they're asked to perform a secondary task. So again, this is using a dual task paradigm that involved one of 2 different processes that is going to interfere with either spatial or visual processing. So in the first one of these, they have a color discrimination task. So they're presented one out of many possible different ranges of colors that are either largely red or largely blue, but they're not necessarily too different from each other, so it's sometimes a little challenging, bit of task to do. And you just need to discriminate which one of these is blue and which one is red. Alternatively, you could be asked to do a movement discrimination task. And in this case, you would have 12 asterisks that would appear on the screen. 11 of them are moving in one direction, and 1 of them is staying static. And you've just got to detect which one is the static asterisk. So these 2 processes have clear differential effects on spatial and visual processing. So the color discrimination task is interfering with visual processing. The movement discrimination task is interfering with spatial processing. And if we look at the performance on the task, that's basically exactly what you end up seeing. So along the y-axis here, we're plotting an interference score. So in other words, the higher this score, the more interference or the worse the performance was in the task. So the memory for the dot locations, this is requiring some degree of spatial processing. Again, this was impaired most when the secondary task was also spatial based. So this purple bar on the left hand side is showing that you get the most interference, the worst performance, when that secondary task is the movement, as opposed to if you've got to do the color discrimination, it doesn't really affect your performance on the task. In contrast, for the ideograph trials, so this is requiring visual processing. You've got to retain that image of the ideograph that's there. That was most impaired when the secondary task was the visual-based discrimination test. So we've basically got a nice sort of double dissociation, suggesting that there are separate visual and spatial systems that are being engaged here. A similar sort of design that might help you understand the difference between spatial and visual processing is to look at two other tasks that you might come across here that have also shown dissociations in performance. So for example, on the left hand side, a task that would require purely visual processing would be to memorize that block pattern that's presented here. So look at that and just remember that pattern. Whereas in contrast, the Corsi blocks that are presented at the top right here, this is a task where you might have to require not just their location, but then the spatial arrangement of where position or block 1 is relative to 2, relative to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that relative location is going to have to require some degree of spatial processing. And again, we find in this, if you have specific distractors that are targeted on visual and spatial processing, there's unique interference effects that tend to occur on both of these.